Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading The American Slave Coast, A History of the Slave Breeding Industry by Ned and Constance Subletti. We're on chapter 17, which starts on page 192. This chapter starts with a quote from Henry Lawrence in a letter he wrote to a Liverpool slave trader named John Knight on May 28, 1756. The title of this chapter is A Rough Set of People, but Somewhat Caressed. The quote says, "That cargo sold at pretty good prices, though they were a month about it. It was a most beautiful cargo of the sort chiefly young people from 15 to 20, which are not accustomed to destroy themselves like those who are older do." So, what he's saying here is that the slaves that were on this ship, aged 15 to 20, were not suicidal. They did not believe in the idea of killing themselves and destroying themselves like those who were older did because they knew what they were losing. And this is the beginning of them enslaving much younger people because they could control them better.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Throughout George Washington's career, it would never be forgotten by the British, the French, nor the Spanish that when the young land speculator was 21 years old, a lieutenant colonel in the British Army, he played a key role in starting the war that deprived France of its North American real estate. As French troops from Louisiana made incursions into the unexplored Ohio Valley, trying to connect France's Canada positions with Louisiana and thus box the British in on the Atlantic coast, they were ambushed on July 3rd, 1754, in what is now southern Pennsylvania, by a detachment led by Washington, with one column of British troops and one column of Native Americans. The British troops had been sent there by Virginia Governor Robert Dinwiddie, in part to protect the land claims of the Ohio Company of Virginia, of which Washington's half brother Lawrence was a co founder. After a skirmish that led to the death and captivity of the French commander Jumonville at the hands of Washington's indigenous ally Tanacharison, Washington was captured and released after signing a confession in French, which he could not read. The Ohio Valley conflict escalated into a global war with London and Paris as the principal belligerents. In America, it became known as the French and Indian War, and in Europe, it was known as the Seven Years' War. Its outcome drastically altered the course of hemispheric history, driving the French out of North America and giving control to Britain of New France, or what we call today Canada. In the final phase of that war, after Spain's Bourbon king Carlos III foolishly entered the conflict on the side of his cousin Louis XV of France, Britain occupied the great harbor of Havana, the hub of Spain's gold and silver shipping empire, for about 10 months. At the war's end, victorious Britain, in another net territorial gain, returned Havana to Spain in exchange for Florida. So, as you can see, there were many strategic partnerships and many strategic alliances. Greetings, Sister Raw, and the elders listening with you. Thanks so much for tuning in. After 198 years as a Spanish Catholic town, St. Augustine was now to become St. Augustine, a British Protestant town. Britain promptly divided Florida into west and east, and the Appalachian River as the eastern boundary between the two. Pensacola was founded as a fort in 1698. It was the capital of West Florida, which had the Mississippi as its western boundary, abutting French Louisiana, and controlled the access to the sea of the Gulf Coast hinterland. St. Augustine was the capital of East Florida, which included the entire peninsula. So as you can see, they've redrawn boundaries and borders throughout since the founding of America. London began giving away, mostly to politically connected Scots, massive amounts of depopulated Florida land it now claimed, as well as large tracts in Georgia. It was the first, but not the last, boom in Florida real estate. During the great speculation in American lands that preceded the American Revolution, writes George C. Rogers Jr., there was more interest in the real estate of East Florida than in the property of any other region of British America. In the years from 1764 to 1770, 2,856,000 acres of East Florida were distributed. Virginia's tobacco was the largest American export, but the low country rice and indigo was the second largest. Greetings, forecast. Thanks for tuning in. Moreover, Virginia's exports were declining while shipments from Charlestown Harbor, one of the colony's busiest, were increasing. As plantations proliferated in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, Charlestown was the great mercantile supplier to all of them, with slaves far and away the highest value merchandise supplied. So they had farms in Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. Debts incurred purchasing slaves mounted up so fast that the importation of Africans was suspended from 1766 to 1769, and disputes over taxation with England depressed importation in 1770 until 1771. But in 1772, and especially in 1773, importation of Africans was enormous. These slaves were often sold in gangs with the result that, as in the sugar territories, people from a single African point of origin wound up on the same plantation, a consciousness that has remained in Black Sea Island folkways, where different islands are understood to have different African cultural influences. Florida was to embody, once again, the British dream of enormous land holdings. One of the first in the door was a leading British capitalist, a Scottish slave trader, a commodity trader, shipping magnate, army contractor, planter, and stock market investor named Richard Oswald, who was one of six owners who built Banks or Bunce Island in the Sierra Leone River into a major slave trading factory. Oswald received 20,000 acres of land in 1764, almost as soon as Florida was open for business. African slaves were brought directly to Florida for the first time, and Oswald soon had 100 of them on his plantation. A dinner at a meeting of the East Florida Society of London, founded in 1766, brought together a group of men that included Richard Oswald and Benjamin Franklin, who thought Oswald was an honest man. So, as you can see, all of this stuff about Benjamin Franklin not being a part of slavery is bullsnot. Oswald's firm was at that time on the first year of its unprecedented 5-year contract with a French society to bring regular shipments of slaves to the war damaged plantations of Saint Domingue and Guadeloupe from their Sierra Leone River base at Banks or Bunce Island, a job only achievable by a modern factory, requiring, as it did, the coordination of regular supplies of people captured in slave raiding and war with shipping schedules and cash flow year in and year out. This type of venture marked a new level of professionalization in business that they had largely been the province of individual merchants working with captains who assembled cargoes as best they could. By the time Grant, Oswald, and Company's French contract expired in 1770, they had delivered 4,847 people. Oswald was a had, Oswald had a remarkable record of picking winners, but his venture in Florida was a bust. As most of the others, the land was unsuited for rice or for sugar. With the handover of Florida to Britain, more than 3,000 of the Spanish colony's people evacuated, most of them fleeing to Cuba, where many established themselves in the communities of Guanabacoa and Regla, now part of the metropolitan Havana. Residents of the free black town of Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mos founded the community of St. Augustine de la Florida in Matanza province. The western part of Cuba, meanwhile, was being reconfigured by sugar. Control of the sugar market had been a major object of contention during the 7 Years' War, and after the abrupt British withdrawal from Cuba, the island entered into its era of sugar prosperity. During its 10 months as an occupier of Havana, Britain had begun aggressive slave importation there, giving new life to Cuba's moribund sugar industry. Cuba had been home to Africans for almost 2.5 centuries at that point, but had not led to massive plantation slavery. And now that began to change. Liverpool slave captains serviced much of this new Cuban market, bringing large numbers of captives supplied by their African trading partners in the Bight of Biafra, the region known as Calabar. Remember, that's a part of their propaganda because their African trading partners that existed oftentimes were trying to keep themselves out of slavery. The African traders of Bani and Old Calabar were particularly powerful and did not allow the establishment of factories by Europeans, giving them a trade advantage. Removing the Spanish antagonist from St. Augustine was a godsend for Carolina and Georgia slave owners. Meanwhile, in compensation for the loss of Florida, the French Louis XV gave Louisiana, in secret at first, to the Spanish Carlos III. Spain was occupied with reasserting Spanish authority in Cuba, where planters had tasted British commerce and weren't going back. So no Spanish governor was sent to Louisiana until 1768, during which time the French and Creole elite of New Orleans further developed its already pronounced independent streak. Spain had no choice but to take Louisiana when the French king handed it over. Though Louisiana produced little of value, it was an essential buffer zone for protecting Spain's Mexican silver mines from the English. So, for approximately the last third of the 18th century, the governor of Louisiana reported to the Captain General of Havana, with enormous cultural consequences for the town of New Orleans, which, under the Spanish, took on the structure of a city and started to be a port of importance. The London economy suffered a panic in 1772, which, coupled with a quickly written and withdrawn incentive plan to encourage poor Protestant immigrants, brought in thousands of desperate Scots, Irish, and especially Scotch Irish to South Carolina. In the 4 days between December 19th and 22nd, 1772, four ships from Northern Ireland disgorged more than 1,000 people into Charlestown. These were poor and uneducated Ulster people, nominally Presbyterians, but in fact barely churched. Henry Lawrence, who dealt in indentured servants as well as slaves, wrote of a group of them: I have been largely concerned with the African trade, yet I never saw an instance of cruelty in 10 or 12 years' experience in that branch equal to the cruelty exercised upon those poor Irish. Self interest prompted the baptized heathen, in the first case, to take care of the wretched slaves for market, but no other care was taken of those poor Protestant Christians from Ireland, but to deliver as many as possible alive on shore upon the cheapest terms, no matter how they fared upon their voyage or in what condition they were landed. So he's saying that it didn't matter how sick they were, how poor they were just white. The coastal land was taken, so most of the new arrivals went up country. More than a decade between the end of the 7 Years' War and the Declaration of Independence, was at a time of great political transformation and opportunity for enterprise. With peace and stability, the low country plantation economy boomed. The growth of rice cultivation expanded enormously owing to the adoption of a new method of irrigation that used sluices to bring in seawater mixed with fresh to make aquaculture possible in the tidewater instead of merely in the inland swamps. South Carolina was the opposite of the decentralized Chesapeake. It was highly centralized in Charlestown, an empire whose commercial relations extended for hundreds of miles. The only place in South Carolina that could be described as a city, Charlestown, it traded via small ocean-going vessels with coastal North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and by land selling the native confederations and the new arrivals upcountry guns to kill each other with, as well as having its own prosperous residents to import goods for. Leah Leela Sellers described it as a sort of city state, drawing its up to itself all of the wealth of the surrounding country, which gave it a prestige, the memory of which has never faded. The easy upward social mobility of the slave society offered white men was described by Alexander Hewitt in 1779 in the course of explaining why he thought, correctly, that industry would not develop in South Carolina. He said, nor is there the smallest reason to expect that manufacturers will be encouraged in Carolina, while landed property can be obtained on such easy terms. The cooper, the carpenter, the bricklayer, the shipbuilder, and every other kind of artificer and tradesman, after having labored for a few years in their respective employments and purchased a few Negroes, commonly retreat to the country and settle tracts of uncultivated land. Though the wages allowed them are high, yet the means of subsistence in towns are also dear, and therefore they long to be in the same situation with their neighbors who derive an easy subsistence from a plantation, which they cultivate at pleasure and are answerable to no master for their conduct. Even the merchant becomes weary of attending the store and risking his stock on the stormy seas, or in the hands of men where it is often exposed to equal hazards, and therefore collects it as soon as possible and settles a plantation. Upon this plantation he sets himself down, and being both landlord and farmer, immediately finds himself an independent man, having his capital in lands and Negroes around him, and his affairs collected within a narrow circle. He can manage and improve them as he thinks fit. He soon obtains plenty of the necessities of life from his plantations, nor need he want any of its conveniences and luxuries. The greatest difficulties he has to surmount arrive from the marshy soil and unhealthy climate, which often cut men off in the midst of their days. Indeed, in this respect, Carolina is the reverse of most countries in Europe, wherein rural life, when compared with that of the town, is commonly healthy and delightful. So, what he was saying is that no matter what profession they start off as, their objective is to get a plantation get slaves, and live a leisurely life because they're lazy. Hewitt wrote that Charlestown may be ranked with the first cities of British America. He estimated its 1765 population to be between 5 and 6,000 white inhabitants and between 7 and 8,000 Negroes, while his estimate for South Carolina as a whole was 40,000 whites and 80 to 90,000 blacks. So if these were his estimates then, what do you think they've been doing to the population and the numbers? Do you think they've been lying about it all this time? Because in 1765, we outnumbered them. When the Declaration of Independence was signed, Charlestown was the fourth largest city in the colonies, far behind Philadelphia and New York in population, and somewhat behind Boston. It was a town of young people, as Hewitt noted. There are few old men or women to be found in the province, which is a sure sign of the unhealthiness of the climate. We cannot say that there are many in the country that arrive at their 60th year. So the climate was such that unfortunately people didn't live a long time. In Charlestown, slaves were crucial to a merchant's offerings, since they drew customers who might then pursue their dry goods from him. Before the Revolution, writes Elizabeth Donnan, at least 100 in Charlestown firms had offered slave cargoes for sale, some advertising but one, others one a year for a number of years, while Brailsford and Chapman in their year of 1765 handled 9 cargoes, two of which outnumbered 400 slaves each. That was exceptional. A big cargo was a lot to handle, and even a large merchant would not normally handle more than 2 or 3 in a year, but there were a lot of merchants. Henry Lawrence was the number one dealer in Africans. During 1760, his firm, Austin Lawrence and Appleby, advertised 1,010 slaves for sale. For purposes of comparison, 3,573 slaves were sold in all of Charlestown for that year beginning November 1st, 1759. In surveying accounts of duties paid, Daniel J. McDonnell identifies Lawrence as involved in the importation of some 6,900 people. That was synonymous with being well capitalized. Charlestown's slave distribution network reached North Carolina, upcountry South Carolina, Georgia, and beyond, but only very wealthy merchants could lay out sums of money necessary for such operations. Since the trade was highly seasonal, April to November, primarily because the cold months killed too many of the captives, capital drain was concentrated in time. On the sale end, the trader had to extend credit and collect, a process that sometimes took years. Lawrence estimated that he often had more than 10,000 pounds sterling loaned out. Advising a pair of young brothers who were hoping to get started as slave traders, Lawrence wrote, "We experimentally know that a large capital is requisite to negotiate a trade in this country. For 700 or 800 Negroes in a year, in the way we have taken them. He took his profits in slaves. By 1776, he owned 797 of them and plantations for them to work on. But this was the man Ben Franklin thought was honest. But smaller, less capitalized merchants could also participate in this chain of value creation. The 1,108 slave cargoes known to have been brought to colonial Charlestown, almost no place else in South Carolina received Africans, were received by 405 different merchants and factors. There was no business easier to make a profit in. Slaves were sold everywhere. Commerce was conducted in Charlestown from Gadsden Wharf, large merchant warehouses, auction houses, plantation grounds, and on the Negro Yard, to a small dry goods stores, and on many public occasions that included Leila Sellers' description, saying, at the race course between the two heats of the races, slaves were still coming from Barbados and Antigua, and occasionally Jamaica, in 1 and 2 digit quantities, but most of the vessels by now were from Africa, perhaps making a stop in the West Indies first and bringing hundreds at a time. The traders had a paper money supply that facilitated their commerce. There was little specie or tradable money in South Carolina for cash purchases, but bills of exchange from reputable London merchants were circulating in some numbers though the supply was subject to sharp fluctuation. Carolina's paper money, first issued in 1703 when North and South Carolina were still one polity, established a security and stability rare in the colonies, writes John J. McCusker. The 7-to-1 rate of exchange between South Carolina currency and London pound sterling remained in effect from the 1730s until shortly before South Carolina's declaration of independence from the British Empire. Henry Lawrence's letter to a London trading firm on August 25, 1763 noted, "A spectacular ninefold markup realized in a slave sale that mixed people from two disparate regions of Africa. Negroes have yielded great prices hitherto, and will continue to do so through the year unless the importations should be excessive. A cargo of Angolas lately averaged 32 pounds sterling and round to 50 prime Gold Coast Negroes brought in Antigua at 34 pounds a head, sold in one lot at 300 round." So the markup was phenomenal because they were making money hand over fist selling slaves. Though we have no specific details of the settlement of that sale, it's close to impossible that a horse cart loaded with tons of silver trudged through the streets of Charlestown. Sales were accomplished with transferable credit of one type or another, and could not have been effected at all unless London merchants were willing to extend credit to the purchasers. In effect, the profit reported by Lawrence that day was money that had not previously existed, but had been written into being at the moment of the sale. in the form of bills of exchange. These sales actively turned people into money. Lawrence firm may have been Charlestown's biggest factorage, but the factor's profits were small compared to those realized by the British merchant houses they were affiliated with. Lawrence was proud of his association with his worthy friend Richard Oswald, whose firm of Grant Oswald and Company shipped 12,742 Africans across the Atlantic that are documented, and an unknown number of others between 1748 and 1770. Arriving in Charlestown to sell a quantity of flour in 1765, the Connecticut merchant Palladia Webster found a town of about 1,000 houses with inhabitants, 5,000 whites and 20,000 blacks. So we outnumbered them 4-1 at this time. A considerable exaggeration in the latter case, but one based on appearances. Webster wrote an enthusiastic account of his sauntering about town, as much as the great hearts will permit, and dining as the guest at the magnificent tables of a succession of Charlestown merchants, all of whom sold slaves as a significant part of their business. In the course of making the social business circuit, he passed some hours with some Guinea captains who are a rough set of people, but somewhat caressed by the merchants on account of the great profits of their commissions. So these were rough people, captains of ships that sold slaves, but he found favor with them. The ship captains may have been coarse, but according to Webster, the merchants who sold human beings by the boatload were anything but coarse. Thomas Smith of Bruton and Smith was a reputable merchant in the town and in very fine business, is an agreeable, sensible kind of man. His brother, Benjamin, one of the wealthiest men in South Carolina, had made a fortune in the slave trade. By then, retired from actively trading, he was a gent of about 50 who was cheerful, easy, and generous. Thomas Shirley of Shirley and Martin was a very polite English gentleman, residing here in very genteel fashion, is an ingenious, ready man, was a bred, a merchant, was bred, a merchant, has traveled much, understands several modern languages. That's what Webster had to say about him. Thomas Liston was a man of great openness and politeness, of generous sentiments and very genteel behavior. Webster traveled with him to Sullivan's Island, which was the entry point for slave cargoes, where there were 200 or 300 Negroes performing quarantine with the smallpox in the local pest house. After hearing some very fine airs on the harpsichord by Mr. So and so, an English organist, he found Charlestown to be a very agreeable and polite place, noting that the laborious business here chiefly done is done by black slaves, of which there are great multitudes. This is what I mean. This is an admission of their laziness. Georgia received its first cargo direct from Africa in 1766 when a Liverpool captain brought in a vessel coming from Senegal with 78 kidnapped people in the hold. The following year, Savannah built a pest house to quarantine new arrivals, like the one at Sullivan's Island for Charlestown, where incoming slaves were expected to remain for a minimum of 10 days. But in the absence of capital to handle sizable African cargo, a larger percentage of Georgia's imports came in smaller shipments from the Antilles, especially Jamaica, but also Antigua, Barbados, St. Christopher, St. Kitts, Grenada, Curacao, and others. Even today, you can hear in the Gullah and Geechee way of talking a marked resemblance to Black speech of the British West Indies. South Carolina was already, at least occasionally, exporting enslaved African Americans to neighboring regions by sea, as when Lawrence shipped off a parcel of country Negroes to British controlled St. Augustine in 1768. With Jamaica and Saint Domingue both taking large numbers of Africans and the African slave trade was reaching its hemispheric peak. Liverpool, London, Bristol, and Lancashire captains competed to open up new sources of supply in Africa. Both forced African immigration and voluntary European immigration to the colonies reached new levels after the 7 Years' War, increasing the colonial population by 10% or so. There were newcomers in every town. Many were getting ready to push west, out where one could own land, albeit at the price of defending one's claim from the Indians. The moving frontier of westward expansion, still in its early stages, kept the market for slaves strong. So, as you can see, their desire for expansion and land and status drove them to continue to exploit the enslaved population, so much so that they, as Dr. John Henrik Clarke would say, and Martin Luther King would say, they provided an economic base and undergird their European peasants, but they gave us nothing because they expected us to be the labor and the money for them the entire time. Ballast is chapter 18's title, written by a collateral descendant of Miss Wheatley for the 1834 edition of Memoir and Poems of Phillis Wheatley. She, Phillis Wheatley, does not seem to have preserved any remembrance of the place of her nativity, which was Senegal, or of her parents, excepting the simple circumstance that her mother poured out water before the sun at his rising. So Phillis Wheatley didn't have any written or documented stories of her family. Iron was fundamental to any kind of industrial development. England had been making iron since the Roman era, but by the beginning of the 18th century, British furnaces had slowed down, not for lack of iron ore, but for lack of fuel, the forests having been consumed. Britain had been importing iron from Sweden, but at the coronation of King George I in 1714 put an end to that because George was at war with Sweden. With commerce between Britain and Sweden frozen, Britain was eager to get iron from its colonies. Maryland made it governmental policy to encourage iron furnaces as of 1719, and the Chesapeake became a leader in colonial iron production. These ironworks produced only bars or pigs because, as codified in the Iron Act of 1750, the colonists were not to have rolling, plating, or slitting mills, much less make steel of their own. The colonials were to be consumers, not manufacturers. Isn't that a strategy that they continue to use to this very day? That we can extract the resources and the wealth out of your country, but you can't refine it yourself. So the colonists weren't even allowed to work iron into rods in the manufacture of nails because supplying nails to plantations was a British business. Americans were expected to buy their iron back in the form of finished nails from the West Midlands naileries, with the cost of two ocean voyages factored into the price. So what they're saying here is that they were paying import taxes twice because they had to get the raw materials in, they had to refine them into bars using the trees and the forests. Then they had to ship them back to England, right? To get refined into nails or into a rod or into a usable product. And then they had to come back to America. By the early 1720s, the Principio Company was already up and running in Maryland from a base in Cecil Country and with holdings throughout Maryland. Owned by English investors, it employed English ironmasters as well as enslaved workers. Using slaves in an industrial setting was something of an experiment, but black men producing iron was not. Iron was a long-time African specialty. A list of Principio's laborers enumerates 26 paid laborers, 10 wageless indentured laborers who had last names, and 13 enslaved laborers who did not have last names. Their names as documented were Ben, Cuzzo, Quash, Quamini, Tantaro, Tom, Prince, Joe James, and Pohick. The enslaved laborers seem to have started in the bottom of the Principio labor chain as woodcutters, feeding the endlessly hungry furnaces. But by 1750, several of them were listed as skilled laborers and they received incentive pay of a shilling per ton of iron blooms produced. Prince was still working at Principio in 1781 at the age of 65 and was classified as a skilled forgeman, along with 55-year-old Harry, 65-year-old Dancer, and 37-year-old Ehrlich and Will. Even during the highest ranking white wage laborers at Principio did not necessarily receive their pay on time. Much of their salary was taken in the form of credit at the notorious institution, the company store, which seems to have been the first part of the enterprise to go into operation. So you see this here? They had white people operating and acting as sharecroppers. If you can imagine that you don't get money for the things that you produce, but you get credit at the company store. So sharecroppers many times got credit at the company store for their harvest, and that credit was often used to get more feed and seeds for the next coming season. So it kept them in a debt cycle, which seems to have been the first part of the enterprise to go into operation, writes Michael W. Robbins in his History of the Company. Needless to say, the black laborers were treated worse than the white employees. A 1781 inventory of the facilities of one of the iron companies, named the Kingsbury Furnace, includes both a kitchen and a Negro kitchen, suggesting that the enslaved ate separately and, to be sure, more poorly. Caloric requirements for the hard labor were high, and though they ate a monotonous diet based on corn, they had to have enough to keep moving. On their feet, they wore what were listed as budget lines in budget lines as Negro shoes, brought in large quantities. They lived in crowded shanties and crude cabins where the privacy was an unknown thing. They were corporately owned in what amounts to as many as 150 enslaved laborers on an iron plantation. Large numbers of support personnel were needed to sustain the iron workers. A few of the enslaved in the iron workers were women who cooked and sewed, and occasionally were iron workers as well. Charles Carroll, the settler, arrived from Ireland to Lord Baltimore's colony in 1688, determined to become wealthy in spite of the discrimination against Catholics in the wake of the Protestant coup of the Glorious Revolution. He became the largest landowner and landlender in Maryland. He began a family line that included a number of people named Charles Carroll, who then needed another name to differentiate themselves, so that Charles Carroll, the settler's son, was Charles Carroll of Annapolis, whose only child and heir was Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Charles Carroll of Annapolis also had a distant relative in the area known as Dr. Charles Carroll, who was the father of Charles Carroll, the barrister. But unlike the previously named Charles Carroll, Dr. Charles Carroll's branch of the family was not Catholic, but was Anglican. So in Annapolis, they spoke of the Catholic Carrolls and the Anglican Carrolls. Hoping to diversify their holdings, Dr. Carroll and four partners, including Charles Carroll of Annapolis, were eagerly looking for alternatives to tobacco as a way to put their capital to work. They started the Baltimore Iron Works, or the Baltimore Company, in 1731 on a choice plot of about 1,300 acres north of the Patapsco River that Dr. Carroll had purchased. The second ironworks in Maryland, it was well situated. The little village of Baltimore was next to a thick vein of iron ore and had a deep water harbor. Before committing to founding the company, Dr. Carroll even drew up a business plan of sorts, which concluded that profitability could be reached in a mere 2 years. In his operating budget, the largest single expense was the purchase of laborers, who were the capital acquisition and were resellable. This earliest of Baltimore industries used a combination of free, indentured, and enslaved labor, beginning the diverse mix of workers that would later characterize the city. By 1734, Baltimore Iron Works had 43 enslaved black laborers. 8 of them were cooks. So, when we talk about this experiment of mixing and diversifying the type of labor that you use to make your company profitable, of course, free labor is going to be the most profitable form of labor. And that's going to bring about and inspire jealousy because unfortunately, you're not paying your workers enough, and you tell your paid laborers that if they don't do the work for these meager wages, you'll just go get enslaved people to do the work for no wages. Does that sound familiar to any of you today? It sounds familiar to me. It sounds like a strategy that they're using in the employment market right now. 30 years later, when Charles Carroll of Annapolis was the richest man in Maryland, he listed his holdings for his son and heirs' benefit, valuing at 10,000 one fifth interest in the company's holdings of 30,000 acres and 150 slaves, young and old. He listed as part of his estimated 88,380 pounds 97 cents of personal wealth, 20 lots in Annapolis with the houses thereon, valued at 4,000 pounds, and 285 slaves on my different plantations at 30 pounds sterling each, valued at 8,550 pounds. 20 built up lots in Annapolis was a substantial holding, but 285 human beings were worth more than twice as much. That letter's addressee, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, became the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence, as well as the wealthiest. Charles Carroll of Carrollton was already price conscious at the age of 29 when he wrote his father's partner, Walter Delaney, on August 29th, 1767, that I am informed that Negroes sell cheap in Virginia, as they are much wanted at the works. Would it not prosper to direct Client Brooke to attend the sales next October? I am told will be the best time to purchase, when it is probable that gentleman says from whom I had my information, young, likely country born Negroes may be brought at 25 or 30 pounds sterling. And he wanted, as you can see, young country born Negroes because he wanted his Negroes to be ignorant, malleable, and trainable. Delaney wrote back, I should be for purchasing Negroes in Virginia, since they are to be had so cheap there as Mr. Carroll mentions. I know of but one reason against doing it of this side of winter, which is that we shall probably have them to all cloth with goods brought here, for it is a very uncertain time as to whether our goods will come in time from England. However, I am willing to run the risk. Apparently, The purchasing did not go forward as Charles Carroll of Carrollton wished. He wrote a circular letter to the other four partners in 1773, complaining that in 1769 I procured from our clerks a list of hirelings' wages at the furnace and at the three forges, which I have often mentioned in my letters to the company, to induce them to purchase slaves to save that enormous experience, but hitherto without success. So he wasn't successful in petitioning them to talk about the slaves that he wanted to buy. He then computed in detail the cost of purchasing slaves, concluding that an annual savings of $901.50 pounds sterling would not be the only advantage the company would reap from the purchase of 40 slaves. The business would be carried on with more alacrity and fewer disappointments. We should increase our stock of Negroes and be greatly benefited by their increase or their breeding in case the company should hereafter come to the resolution of selling their lands or leasing them, selling their stock, and breaking up the iron works. So, as you can see, he didn't even see his enslaved people. He saw us as horses to be bred, because if he bought enough of them, then he would see the benefit of quote unquote natural increase, which is us procreating together. It was good business to own slaves instead of rent them, and the richer one became, the easier it was to do. By purchasing slaves, not only did the partners save on labor costs in day to day operations, they acquired human capital that could be sold or rented out. A few years later, on December 3rd, 1773, the 71-year-old Charles Carroll of Annapolis wrote a good news letter to his only son and heir, Charles Carroll of Carrollton. I have taken a very exact account of all the Negroes here. I was closely employed 5 mornings from breakfast to dinner and 2 long evenings in comparing the last with my present list. They amount to 330, including the 3 jobbers with you. My love and blessing to you. He continued, Negroes as price list taken declared on the first on December 1st, 1773, he had 330. Due as price list taken December 1st, 1767, he had 273. The increase in slaves, natural increase in slaves in 6 years was 57. So, over the course of 6 years, by doing nothing other than owning human beings and letting them or forcing them to reproduce with one another, he increased his wealth by 57 enslaved people. Carroll's return on investment in Negroes was almost 21% in 6 years. Those extra 57 people also increased Carroll's liquidity, since slaves could be disposed of more readily than any other holding. As the South developed what little industry it would have, slave labor was omnipresent, positioned, positioning positing a model of industrial slavery in which either the workers and their children were corporate assets or the workers were hired from local owners via employment agents specializing in slave labor. So even when they don't pay you, they figure out a way to value, commoditize, and extract value from you. But slave labor was problematic in an industrial setting. Gang labor in the field was a blunt instrument, and agricultural slaves were notoriously recalcitrant or resistant to training. That spirit couldn't be set loose on expensive factory machinery. Enslaved factory laborers had to be paid incentives to work properly. But paying wages to slaves was seen by the slave owners as a hazardous practice. Indeed, many slave owners believed that paying wages to anyone set a dangerous precedent. The legacy of the old days, all visible all over the eastern shore of Maryland. In Crumpton, the effects of a fine old house were auctioned one day in January 2011. Among the items the auctioneer turned over was a two-piece ring of iron, just big enough to fit around someone's neck. It was a slave collar found in the basement of the house. When it was knocked down for $90, the ghost of slavery threw off yet another commission for an auctioneer. Chestertown's population was 5,252 in the year 2010's census, not much more than in the late 18th century. Like many English colonial towns, Chestertown has, besides a Queen Street, it has a High Street and, adjacent to the harbor, a Water Street, also known as Front Street, where the building known as the Custom House sets dates to 1746 or so. Located as it is on the waterfront of the Chester River on the eastern shore of Maryland, the Custom House was at one time the home of a wealthy merchant who traded in slaves and convicts. His name, Thomas Ringgold IV. In America, as is in England, much of the business of African slavery belonged to Roman numeral generations of wealth, with a surname that spoke directly to money. Thomas Ringgold I was one of many Anglicans who left England during the Puritan regime, which was from 1647 until 1660. Only 16 years after the Ark and the Dove brought the first Maryland colonists, he arrived in Maryland with his two sons in 1650. He acquired an Eastern Shore estate in 1657 by marrying a widow. So he didn't have money of his own. He married a widow, which was a common means of enrichment for men in land in a land of high morality and few rights for women. By the great great grandson, Thomas Ringgold IV's time, in the mid 18th century, Chestertown was one of the most important ports on Maryland's eastern shore, second only to Annapolis in all of Maryland, and the Ringgolds were its leading family. Together with his son, Thomas Ringgold V, and his brother, William Ringgold, the energetic Thomas Ringgold IV imported a variety of goods besides British manufacturers. The strong, sweet, fortified wine the colonists drank was from Portugal, England's oldest trading partner. West Indian molasses, and of course, the indentured servants, convict labor, and African slaves. It was his good fortune to be able to be at his peak during the boom years for colonial merchants after the French and Indian War, when explosive immigration driven population growth made for an active commercial world throughout the bustling colonies. As merchants profited from supplying the new arrivals, the newly wealthy were furnishing exquisite mansions. Ringgold IV brought the almost new custom house from its tavern keeper builder in 1749, and it became both his residence and his place of business. He appears to have been the wealthiest man in Kent County, though he had competition from his next lot neighbor, Thomas Smith, whose magnificent Georgian mansion, called Whitehall, was built in 1769, and it still stands on the former water lot number 16 across from High Street from the Custom House. 18th century businessmen were necessarily diversified, and Ringgold IV was an attorney, planter, importer, exporter, merchant, and retailer. He shipped out tobacco and iron. The two went together, with the iron serving as the ballast, and by the 1670s, with the Chesapeake already making a transition out of tobacco, he was loading wheat onto an increasing number of ships. So you see how he continuously diversified his options. He was into slaves and iron, but as things started cooling down, he switched over to wheat. Fueled by the growth of mercantile revenues, building after solid building went up in Annapolis, the small, wealthy colonial capital that had been designed in the European style. Its peculiar Baroque pattern of streets radiating outward from two circular plazas called Church Street and State Street, they were joined by a road of symbols, the Anglican union of the two, and was unlike the square grid pattern already in effect in the Philadelphia and Burlington, New Jersey buildings. With overhead cabling and signage having been removed in the mid 20th century to enhance the time capsule effect, Annapolis is today a living reminder of the Enlightenment's rational organization of space, a logical order imposed on a small urban area. At the peak of Annapolis's influence, about a third of its population was enslaved, mostly in domestic service. With a population of only 1,000 or so, Annapolis was the most stylish town of its size in the North American colonies. The social leader of the Chesapeake. A theater opened in 1771 where the Annapolitans saw what it had decades before been the most popular works of London stage: Joseph Addison's Cato, John Gay's The Beggar's Opera, and Isaac Bickerstaff's afterpiece, The Padlock. with its comedic, Spanish-derived, black-faced character Mungo, the precursor of black minstrelsy. Annapolis even had a colonial version of macarones, the young, effeminate Italian dandies with comically big hair who burst on the London scene in 1772 as a lampoon in Yankee Doodle. So they were making fun of the Americans at that time, and they were trying to come up with a stereotypical gaff or stereotypical representation of these particular characters so that they could use it as propaganda to continue to weaponize the image of the black man against us. Many of the wealthy men who founded the American nation passed through Annapolis and Chestertown, which were cheerful stops on the dreary overland route between Virginia and Philadelphia. The only road that ran south from Philadelphia divided in Delaware, one branch going to the eastern shore and the other to the western. The Eastern Shore branch, the quicker of the two, ran through Chestertown, from where it continued on to connect the ferry that was, as of 1762, ran between the Eastern Shore's Rock Hall, later a small town, but then a terminal, across the Chesapeake to Annapolis. Publishing magnate Benjamin Franklin, traveling home to Pennsylvania from Virginia on official business after having been appointed Deputy Postmaster General of the colonies, attended a January 1754 meeting of the Annapolis' celebrated Tuesday Club. This was a social club in the London style where participants took on funny names. Franklin, internationally famous as a scientist, was dubbed Electrico Vitrifice or Electric Glass Stroker, made ribald jokes, long-standing members, that sort of thing, and sang drinking songs. In Charleston, in Chestertown, Franklin, whose postmaster position paid little but was of great benefit to his newspaper business, handed over his Eastern Shore accounts receivable for the Pennsylvania Gazette to Ringwald IV for collection. Across the bay from Chestertown, Ringgold the Fourth's partner, Samuel Galloway III, who lived from 1720 until 1785, was one of the most important merchants in Annapolis. Galloway was a Quaker and thus a second-class citizen. There were even whispers among Anglicans that the Quaker ranks concealed Catholics in disguise. Spanning both sides or both shores of the Chesapeake, the Galloway-Ringgold partnership was a commercial force linking Annapolis and Chestertown, locked down with strategic weddings. Ringgold the Fifth, who lived from 1744 to 1776, married Galloway's daughter, Mary, while Galloway's other daughter, Anne, in turn married into another merchant family, the Chestons. So as you can see, they continually had to shore up their finances and their resources, and they married amongst themselves in the attempt to not let any of those finances or resources out of their community loop. When the Mount Vernon planter, George Washington, ordered from a merchant a pipe about 126 gallons of your best Lisbon wine, the price to be drawn against his account in London, he asked that it receive a freight in any of Mr. Galloway's or Mr. Ringold's vessels. That Washington should be on the friendly terms with Galloway and Ringgold was hardly surprising. The wealthy of Virginia and Maryland formed a tight society with interlocking kinship by marriage at the heart of the business world. By marrying the widow Martha Custis, Washington had become a large slave owner and a rich man, rich enough in the long run that he could wear his own custom designed uniform when he served 8 years at the head of the Continental Army without pay, and rich enough that he could be a racing enthusiast. Thoroughbred racing, an amusement for the truly wealthy, had become popular in England after the restoration of Charles II in 1660. It came to Virginia quickly, where it became a central social activity of the ruling class and arrived in Annapolis in 1745. Washington's health wasn't sufficient to put him in the league of racehorse owners, but he traveled hundreds of miles to hobnob at Annapolis, noting in his ledger on October 10th, 1772, cash lost on the races, £1 6 pence. On occasion, he enjoyed the hospitality of Tulip Hill, Galloway's country estate, which still exists. Galloway was the owner of Salem, the most famous native colonial Chesapeake racer, whose heyday was at the height of the town era between 1766 and 1772. Wealthy slave owners were investing in the expensive hobby of horse breeding that tends to be a racing culture. 27 stud farms have been identified in colonial Virginia. Saline had cost Galloway £178 on 3 years' credit, a heavy outlay at a time when an enslaved male laborer might be had for £35. Even so, Salim was profitable. Besides winning races, he earned stud fees by covering the mares of Maryland's wealthiest, as did those sired from him. In 1793, it was advertised in Chestertown that one of Salim's grandsons, named Liberty, of course, will cover at $6 each mare the season, noting that country produce at market price will be received to pay for the stud service. Galloway kept the detailed stud book, now in the possession of the Maryland State Archives. Galloway was diversified. He planted tobacco and wheat, invested in ironworks, and owned a stand of oak trees that, quote unquote, was the envy of all shipbuilders along the eastern seaboard, writes J. Rainey Kelly. In 1757, during the French and Indian War, he built and outfitted an 18-gun privateer and advertised for a crew. He tried and failed after launching a distillery that was an essential asset for going into the African slave trade from North America. Colonial documents contain page-long lists of the finer things and basic necessities merchants imported. The lists include horses, cheese, candles, glass, paper, carpets, overcoats, hats, shoes, and on and on and on in many varieties. Merchants also imported money in many different forms, functioning in essence as black mini banks. They had to be agile mental calculators since the currency had handled in a non decimal denominated system of 20 shillings to a pound and 12 pence to a shilling was issued by myriad sources, each with its own exchange rate or discount, reflecting varying degrees of confidence in the solidarity of the issuer. Frequently, debts were collected in merchandise, which meant keeping track of commodity price trends. The merchandise then had to be resold or traded for something else that could be done at Ringgold's store on the ground floor of the Front Street building. Ringgold traded in real estate as well, of course, but the way to make real estate valuable was to apply labor to it. No, merchandise was more urgent or more potentially lucrative than laborers. So, as you can see, the most expensive thing, the most important thing, the most profitable thing that any planter has on his plantation are his free laborers. In front of a house on Queen Street in 21st century Chestertown, the trees are set off from the sidewalk by a perimeter of rounded, water-torn stones that, as Peregrine Wolfe described them in 1871, which was shortly after our liberation. This was after the slaves had been told they were free in Georgia, so this in Texas, so this was after our true liberation. And he wrote, "Are not natives our alluvial district, being entirely different from any that I have ever seen in Traditionally, we are informed that they were brought to this country in ships from England, which traded for tobacco as ballast. In the early times of the colony, tobacco being our staple crop for exportation, the stones being thrown out to take the cargo were afterwards used to pave the approach to the wharfs. If I can procure you iron," wrote Ringgold of an arriving sea captain, "I shall get his ballast, which I want to complete my wharf. Pigs of iron made for profitable Negro cargo going back to London." The commerce in question was not the notorious clockwise or triangular trade, but a less efficient, colonially disadvantaged, back and forth monopoly circuit between North America and England. Ballast was necessary in both directions, but more of it was needed on the long westbound trip to America. Because there was less cargo in the hold on the outbound voyage, tobacco, the Chesapeake colony's principal export, was a bulky commodity. The goods of a ship would bring from London and exchange took up much less room. Freight, freight was expensive, and shipping stones from England to Maryland was unprofitable. But the slack in a lopsided balance trade is often up by cheap labor, and an unprofitable cargo of ballast stones could share the hull with a profitable cargo of unfortunate people. That's where Ringgold and Galloway came in. They imported British convicts, a product line with a dependable supply, as there were always plenty of prisoners on hand in Britain, already being processed into the penal system. A steady flow of convicts in irons and colonial merchants' dreams, and was a specialty of English port of Bristol. Ringgold was a factor or agent for the Bristol firm on Sugley, Hillhouse, and Randolph, whose deported convicts received pardons for their crimes in exchange for indentures of labor in America. So they could get all of their criminal past washed away. You never know what happened to these people if they just come be an indentured servant in America. Greetings, Zachary Holmes. Thanks so much for tuning in. I appreciate you for being here. Some were felons, pirates, rogues, or dissenters, but others were merely indebted. And to judge from a number of advertisements in the Maryland Gazette for the return of various runaways described as a convict servant lad, a number of them were boys between the ages of 16 and 19 years of age. Convicts and paupers were in any case bundled together in the servant business, mixing the truly dangerous with the merely malnourished. While the number of convicts who were brought to America is difficult to state with any precision, the high quality records of Annapolis indicate that by 1776, that port he had handled 8,846 convicts, making the merchants who sold them rich. The difference between indentured and enslaved labor was often negligible in terms of their actual work performed by the laborer. From the beginning of the indentured servitude in America, tales circulated in England about how the indentured were made to work right alongside the enslaved. It was common to refer to the purchase of indentured laborers as per the 1774 letter from Charles Carroll of Carrollton authorizing a Baltimore Iron Works representative to purchase 5 Negroes and 5 white servants for industrial labor. But there was a significant difference between the two. The convict laborer was not bound for life, but the black slave was. Nor was the indentured servant's potential for natural increase part of the deal, as it was for the enslaved. We got Zachary Holmes from Chicago, Illinois. Thank you so much. In the television miniseries Roots, which we know was propaganda, right? Because Alex Haley was sued about that, and they were successful in suing him about that. Nevertheless, in the TV miniseries Roots, as in Alex Haley's novel on which it is based, this fictional protagonist, Kunta Kinte, was brought from the Gambia and sold at Annapolis in 1767. That was when Samuel Galloway was conditioning his slave sales at Middleton's Tavern, like the one he advertised in 1761, presumably of captives brought up from the West Indies, since they were already seasoned. His ads often read, "To be sold at the house of Mr. Samuel Middleton in Annapolis on Saturday next, being the 22nd instance, a choice parcel of healthy, seasoned Negro men, S. Galloway and Company." A parcel might be 2 or 4 dozen people, which is less than a cargo, but it could also be hundreds of people. Ringgold and Galloway sold at least one cargo in 1761, but it was not a good sale. On July 29, 1761, Samuel Galloway posted the following ad: "Just imported in the Snow Alexander Captain Nielsen from the coast of Africa, a cargo, which is a lot, of choice healthy slaves, and to be sold on Tuesday next, being the 4th of August, at Annapolis, for bills of exchange or cash, by Thomas and William Ringgold." The promise of choice healthy slaves was a bare-faced lie. They were the wretched captives who arrived on the Alexander, a vessel that had been outfitted to carry 320 humans as if they were sardines. The Alexander had been met with misfortune, as Ringgold and Galloway wrote the ship's owners in Bristol afterwards, resulting in the loss of so great a part of her slaves. We had but 105 left alive to sell. 11 of them were so bad off that we were glad to get £11 sterling per head for them. 6 of the 11 have since died, and many of the others were in very bad condition. It is unknown whether the misfortune was smallpox, typhoid, measles, or any of the other number of diseases that would carry away shiploads of people. It took a while to work through the undesirable inventory, but slaves rarely went unsold. Ringgold wrote Galloway on August 15th of the liquidation, saying, "We sold 14 of the Negroes yesterday, very well considering the condition they were in. The wenches and one man at £60 each. One man at £68, one boy at £60, girls at £56, and 2 sickly girls, cheap. The mate's boy for £70. The small poor boy died coming up. We have only the 2 mates, fellow, and 2 girls, and hope they go today." This was the business correspondence, formal and decorous, in the manner of colonial merchants, and devoid of remorse for over 200 deaths, let alone the partners' responsibility in them. Then Ringgold delivered what he saw as the really bad news, saying, "But the worst of it was chiefly on some credit." So what he's saying is that he had financed this cargo of sick, enslaved people that all almost died in transport. He only had 105 of the expected 320, and they weren't selling at premium dollar because they were sickly. No Chesapeake merchants were exclusively slave traders in those days, but the converse of that was that many merchants might handle some slave trade, and every merchant was aware that the slave trade was murderous. But then life was precarious in the colonies, where children routinely died. Childbirth was every woman's hazard, and the wealthiest citizen might take sick and be gone within hours. The crews on occasion had higher mortality rates than the people who made up the cargo. Slave ships were death ships, the bottom of the employment ladder for sailors. Stephen D. Barrett, analyzing the mortality of 58,778 crewmen on 1,709 slave voyages out of Liverpool from 1780 forward, found 10,439 deaths, or 17.8%. About half of them were killed by the captives. The seasoning process for newly arrived Africans was often more deadly than the crossing. Some emaciated arrivals expired dockside. Others died unattended in the pest house, which is where they gave them their vaccines and inoculations. Where the healthy were locked up together with the dying in quarantine. Still others took mortally ill within months after sail. So as you can see, there were quite a few things that could have happened to these people as they continued in their voyage. Slave buyers and merchants had a definite hierarchy of desirable African ethnicities. Gambians were at the top of the list, both in the Chesapeake and in South Carolina. One reason was that the voyage from the northernmost part of West Africa slaving territory was significantly shorter than from farther south, and there was less time for the captives to sicken and die. As Ringgold IV put in a letter, Gambia, the best and generally comes in best health, as the passage is quick from thence to this place. Though the passage surely seemed to last an eternity for those chained in the hold. The cultivation of tobacco was well suited to Senegambians' existing agricultural skills. How did they know that they had these types of skills? Because they had been going over there on missions, observing people, and no one stopped them. Conveniently, they were at this time easy to get, and availability that peaked at the first 3 decades of the 18th century as intra-African conflicts in the region threw war captives onto the market. The Bambara, the Wolof, the Mandinka, the Fulani. They brought with them not only agricultural skills, but all kinds of cultural skills, including music. They brought the banjo and the bow fiddle, the latter a specialty of the nomadic Fulani, which they used to play a highly ornamented dance music. They brought a sense of swing in which pairs of notes were not of equal length, but were long and short together. They brought a bardic poetic tradition that informed their way of singing, and at least they brought a century old history of contact with Islam. The musical styles of the Muslim world affected their way of playing music greatly, and aspects of it, mel- melisma, pitch bending, and heterophony, which is a loose name for unison, would surface in a new African American music. Senegambians were early populators of all three major African American cultural areas: the Chesapeake, the Low Country, and Louisiana. But there were people from all seven of the major slaving regions of West and Central Africa, and perhaps a few from the eighth, which was South Africa, in Chesapeake society. Even the biggest tobacco planters didn't purchase labor in the quantities Antillean sugar planters did. Most slaves in the Chesapeake were brought in small numbers, many in ones and twos. Even large plantation workforces were assembled piecemeal out of the heterogeneous sources. So they were sourcing people from the same places. Annapolis was a breakup point where cargoes were separated into smaller parcels for local distribution. Once the captives had been sold, they were plantation bound, so their next journey was to be shipped along the watercourse of the Chesapeake River system and possibly marched overland in their traumatized condition, often half dead from their ordeal. They were traded and retraded around the waterways along with other merchandise, traversing a web of trades and planters. They were all connected by water along the decentralized Chesapeake system's thousands of miles of fractal coastline and riverbank. Africans had long worked as sailors in European navies. Now African descendants, raised in their intricate world of Chesapeake creeks and marshes, would become its boatmen, pilots, and navigators. By contrast, with the convict trade, the African slave trade was unpredictable. It was the high stakes venture with remunerative upside, but facing hazards unlike those of any other business. Given the dangers of the trade, a slave ship might never return. Even on a successful run, it could be incommunicado for a year or more, collecting one or a few captives at a time on the African coast, bargaining anew for each one, on occasion waiting for slave raids of nearby battles to end so that fresh victims could be procured. Though the upside was high, outfitting African slave trade expeditions was a nerve-wracking business. There are more disasters in these voyages than any others whatever, Ringgold told Galloway. The return on investment at best was excruciatingly slow, and, as with the other risks of slavery, it was best absorbed by large fortunes. Colonial merchants sent their own expeditions to Africa as early as 1643, when a ship from Boston brought African captives to Barbados. But even for men of Galloway and Ringgold's wealth, it was hard to outfit an expedition from Africa to America. For one thing, the African traders who sold captives to the Guineamen wanted specific merchandise for their domestic markets in exchange for the most of it wasn't available to the colonies. For the most part, most of what they wanted wasn't available to the colonies. The African market was known for its fastidiousness, both in terms of goods it would accept and the variety of them it demanded. Willem Bosman, the Dutch West India Company's factor at Elmina, wrote in 1703 that to trade on this coast, about 150 several sorts of commodities are necessary. Though he pleaded that the specific list Though he pleaded that the specific list was a trade secret, African merchants' conditions had many regional variations, but generally they wanted gold and silver, guns and gunpowder, textiles, hardware, brass basins and pans, luxury goods, principally rum and tobacco, and vast quantities of copper, which was a common material for adornment and in the form of rods or bracelets called manillas, was Africa's most common currency. Except for the rum and tobacco, none of this came from the colonies. So you see how they've told us for years that, oh, your African brethren traded you for consumable goods. They traded you for rum and cigarettes. Well, they tell that lie because the reality is that those were the only things that the colonies could produce on their own that the Africans wanted. There was a much larger list here that we went over, and those were the things that they wanted to protect and defend themselves and to adorn themselves, probably with power based on their belief system, because they wanted the silver and the gold. They wanted precious metals to imbue themselves, to imbue objects with, and to create objects. Accordingly, rum was of central importance to the portion of the African slave trade outfitted from America. Beginning in Newport in the 1720s, Rhode Island's slave activities grew out of its rum manufacturing, that in turn depended on molasses illegally imported from Saint Domingue, whose syrup was cheaper than the Jamaican variety. So, see, even in trying to make the rum that they could make, they wanted to do it on the cheap. So, they got it from Saint Domingue versus Jamaica. The unusually well documented voyage of the Providence slaver Sally was probably typical. It went loaded with more than 17,000 gallons of rum, along with tobacco and onions, to be introduced into the African market in exchange for people. So they only took consumable goods over there. With its many distilleries, Rhode Island was the only North American colony to specialize in outfitting slavers, approximately 1,000 voyages accounting for an estimated 111,000 captives over its trading life. Can you imagine that? Throughout its trading life, over 111,000 captives. Rhode Island ran a clockwise loop that carried New England rum to Africa in exchange for Africans who in turn taken who were in turn taken to the West Indies or sometimes North America and exchanged for molasses, which was then brought to Rhode Island for distilling into rum, and so on and on. In theory, with a profit taken at every stop. In this way, Rhode Island in the 18th century became the largest outfitter of slaving voyages in North America, with Newport sometimes referred to as the American Liverpool. Conspicuously, this commercial triangle did not include England, nor did it necessarily include much hard currency. If the African slave traders could be persuaded to accept rum and tobacco or consumable goods, they usually wanted manufactured goods or money too. South Carolina did little smuggling. Its commerce largely followed British rules. But New England was a hotbed of contraband. According to Britain's routinely ignored 1733 Molasses Act, importation from the French colonies was to be prohibitively taxed. So they put a tariff on it. In the face of the need to raise revenue against Britain's debts from the French to Indian War, from the French and Indian War, the Sugar Act of 1764 halved the molasses tax but included measures to enforce it, causing widespread alarm throughout New England, where distilling was a major business. The merchants of Provence responded by sending London a ringing defense of their right to smuggle molasses, pointing out that the rum thus produced gave them the revenues to which to pay for the British manufactures they consumed. So, what they were saying is that in order to afford the things that you want us to buy from you, we have to smuggle molasses in from Antigua, from Guadalupe and Saint Domingue, because if we don't, we won't be able to afford to support your economy. Recalling the era, John Adams wrote in an 1818 letter saying, I know not why we should blush to confess that molasses was an essential ingredient in American independence. These articles of molasses and sugar, especially the former, the molasses, entered into all and every branch of our commerce, fisheries, even manufactures and agriculture. The anti slavery Adams discreetly neglected to mention the vital role molasses had played in the slave trade. And what was that role? They used the molasses to make the rum to buy the slaves. To give the devil his due, Rhode Island slave trade was an extraordinary achievement given the obstacles to it by a feat Maryland did not replicate. The only known African slave voyage outfitted from Maryland was sent by Ringgold and Galloway in 1762. Together with two other partners, though Galloway may have invested in others of which there is no record, it was a fiasco. In an effort to stock their Africa-bound ship with commodities or consumables for trade, Ringgold traveled to Philadelphia. The decentralization of the Chesapeake had worked against the creation of urban centers in favor of widely scattered individual wharfs, a situation pleasing to price gouging English merchants, because you have all these different pit stops and you don't know which one has the best price. In doing so, it created a commercial vacuum for Philadelphia to exploit. Philadelphia, which had surpassed Boston as the largest city in the colonies in the 1750s, was one of the commercial capital. No, was the commercial capital. with the best supplied marketplace. But even there, as Ringgold wrote Galloway, saying, I found a great deal of trouble and diligence required to get anything, and several things I did not get. So I was obliged to supply the defects by Manchester goods in an imitation as well as I could. I was put to great difficulty about guns and could not find any of the trading guns but 21 in town. Trading guns are low quality guns that could misfire, made out of made primarily out of the cast off iron that they had. So they were selling them substandard weapons. Getting so few guns in Philadelphia, I wrote to Mr. Freeman to try to pick up 100 or less at New York of the cheap sort and send them with the rum. The Scottish slave trader Richard Oswald, in contrast, by 1754, notified the British government of his intention to ship 120 barrels of gunpowder, 120 chests containing 3,000 trading guns, and 30 cases containing 3,000 cutlasses to Africa. But even British slave traders had difficulties coming up with enough trade goods. Assembling an export cargo normally took several months, writes Kenneth Morgan, who argues that one of the advantages Liverpool traders had over those of Bristol and London was their proximity to the Isle of Man, which was a duty-free zone until 1765. Dutch shippers could transship cheap products from Asia that included cowrie shells, which were used as money in many parts of Africa, as well as those perennial trade offerings to Africa, textiles and lethal weaponry. Coin was equally difficult for even an affluent American to obtain. Merchants rarely received it. I wrote him also as to dollars, Ringgold Letters continues, referring to silver pesos. Not one of them got not one of them to be gotten in Philadelphia. The partners' slave ship made it to Africa and back, but the kidnapped Gambians never reached Maryland. To their consternation, the captain stopped off in Antigua and sold every last one of them there. If he was to go to the nearest place, fulminated Ringwald, why did he not take them to Barbados, where slaves are wanted and would have sold very well? Though the captain's side of the story appears to be lost to history, it might have been that much of his cargo had died and he feared losing it all if he continued any further. At any rate, that's why Hopkins, captain of the previously mentioned Sally, dumped into the Antiguan market of 1765 the 87 naked, emaciated captives who remained alive out of the 186 he had embarked from Africa with, instead of bringing them farther north. These were complicated deals, dear sir, Ringgold wrote Galloway in 1764. I have been looking over our Guinea accounts since I came home, and they are really almost out of my hand. I wish we could get them settled whilst we still understand them. So even though trading in slaves was popular, and even though trading in slaves was financially beneficial, it wasn't always beneficial for them because the slaves would die off, the captains would divert the trip and go somewhere else and sell the slaves. They had all of these different things that could happen to the enslaved people. Like other merchants' letters, Ringgold's correspondence was full of complaints about business. But he was also making money. In 1767, he added to his portfolio the property which with enclosed grounds with water and cannon streets, a block upriver from the custom house, commissioning Virginia architect William Buckland to tie together two existing structures and create a grand new mansion with a double staircase, a style that was becoming popular among the wealthy. Today, this is known as the Henson Ringgold House and is the presidential residence of Washington College. We're almost done, guys. I'm sorry it's taking so long, but I wanted to get through this so that we could get to the next section, which is going to be part 3 of our book. The Baltimore Museum of Art has portraits of Ringgold by American master Charles Willson Peake, but there are no portraits existent of Sue, Fender, Milford, Betty, Suki, Sarah, Cynthia, Darky, and Will Harding, whom Will Ringgold bequeathed to his wife Anna Maria when he died in 1772 at the age of 57. Born into a fortune, he left a greater one to his only son. In the tradition of the time and place, the Ringgolds were hospitable. When George Washington passed through one night in 1773, he lodged at the Ringgolds, according to the Henson Ringgold House, home of Thomas Ringgold V, who went into the family business of buying and selling and continued the family tradition of politics. Along with his uncle William Ringgold and neighbor Thomas Smith, Ringgold V was one of 7 Kent County signers of the Maryland Declaration of Independence in Annapolis on July 26, 1775. And he was a delegate to the Annapolis Convention, which met on May 8, 1776, so just about a year later, to draft a constitution for the state. But he died unexpectedly on October 26th of 1776 at the age of 32. The short-lived Ringgold V left behind a will in which he bequeathed the Chestertown mansion to his mother. He also left her his car, not a motor car, of course, but, as he put it, my imported chariot. The 3-seat coach with a perch for an enslaved driver and a roost for an enslaved footman, in which she rolled up and down High Street. So she wanted to be revered. After her son died, she wanted to be seen as big and important. And so they put her in that chariot and rode her up and down High Street. Because Annapolis is so well documented and preserved, and because so much archaeology has been done there, we know that under the steps leading down into a basement room in Charles Carroll of Carrollton's mansion, Nanny, the cook, placed a spirit bundle. Known throughout a wide area of Africa in different forms, these bundles in their North American manifestation include such specific items as bent nails, or the Zarabanda, they call him in Cuba, the Congo blacksmith spirit with the power secret of iron and 4 whole buttons, as well as organic ingredients that did not survive the centuries. It seems likely that more spirit materials will turn up, especially now that there is a greater awareness of their existence. They're not that easy to identify, though, because they're mostly mundane objects. It's the combination of them that gives them away as spirit materials. None have been identified from the 17th century in the Chesapeake, which is the earliest known which the earliest known is from Virginia in 1702, the earliest known spirit bag, while the earliest known spirit object in Maryland dates from 1790. So these things may have been commonly produced, but because they look so mundane and ordinary, then people often pass them by. Christianity was a religion of the book, and the slaves were not supposed to know how to read. Even as slave owners prohibited the use of African drums on their plantations, they often preferred that the enslaved not be Christianized, and many of them never were, especially in the colonial era. But there was never a moment when the enslaved were not spiritually conscious. In the new land, the Africans had been dragged to across the ocean of the dead, according to Congo cosmology. They fashioned a set of religious practices that developed with significant regional variations and with Native American influence into a broadly generalized African American religion that was also a social mediator and a medicinal practice. Karina Hazard Donald calls this set of practices the old hoodoo religion, arguing that it is developed in available safe spaces and proposing that the mid 18th century must have been a crucial time in the crystallization of this wide reaching system. In different regional forms, this old hoodoo religion radiated outward from the 3 great fountains of African American culture: the Chesapeake, the Low Country, and the Gulf South. Its persistence was described by Lewis Hughes in his 1897 autobiography when he said, "It was the custom in those days for slaves to carry hoodoo bags. It was handed down from generation to generation. And though it was one of the superstitions of a barbarous ancestry, it was still very general and tenaciously held to by all classes. I carried a little bag, which I got from an old slave who claimed that it had the power to prevent anyone who carried it from being whipped. It was made of leather and contained roots, nuts, pins, and some other things. The claim that it would prevent the folks from whipping me so much, I found, was not sustained by my experience. My whippings came just the same. Many of the servants were thoroughly believers in it, though, and carried these bags all the time." So, what he's saying is that the enslaved people created a religion of their own based off of their African cosmological perspective and the Christianity that they were consistently being introduced to. Because it concerned the transformation of a variety of traditional African religions into one spiritual tradition, Hazard Donald writes, Hoodoo must have involved a major confrontation of spiritual forces. Mandi speakers from the Islamicide Sahel, Akan from the Gold Coast, Fon from the Slave Coast, Igbo from the Calabar, and many other peoples from the zone of West African traditional practices, Bakongo from Catholicized Central Africa. Their cosmologies had elements in common and all played a part in the composite religious understanding of the enslaved. Because Monticello had been so thoroughly scrutinized by architects, we know that Thomas Jefferson's enslaved kept pits under their floors, a common practice among the enslaved of Virginia at the time. What did they keep in those pits? Anything valuable, anything they didn't want Master Tom or the other members of their community to see. Goods that could be considered stolen, which, since they would have to have no legal property of their own, might mean anything of value. They created spirit materials for that. The tour guide to Monticello's Mulberry Row, an entire street of slave cabins and workhouses that in Jefferson's day was hidden from the big house's view by mulberry trees, will tell you that cowrie shells, historically used as money in many parts of Africa, were later passed to later generations by Monticello's laborers and were worn as jewelry or attached as clothing. Some of the people at Monticello wore pierced silver coins around their necks and ankles. They were not mere adornment. The formerly enslaved Sylva Witherspoon recalled in 1937 in Alabama that, as transcribed, sometimes I wears them this dime with the hole, this dime with the hole in it around my ankle to keep off the conjure. Portable spirit bundles were carried by nomadic and migrating Africans in societies that counted the departed as living presences. Called by various names in different territories of Africa and the New World, a portable spirit bundle. Though not containing ancestors' remains, as in the motherland, was known in the southern United States as a mojo bag, which is a Kikongo word meaning something like soul force. Mentions of a mojo hand are familiar from the blues lyrics, and mojo hands of one kind or another continue holding and using today. Another version of the mojo hand was called by an English name, a Toby, as per the first line in Charles Burnett's film To Sleep with Anger, about spirit combat in South Central Los Angeles. I was looking through my trunk and I can't find my Toby, a foreshadowing that bad things are about to happen. How did it come to be called a Toby? We can't prove this, but there is some intriguing circumstantial evidence. It was in the 1760s, the heyday of Annapolis and Chestertown, and of Galloway and Ringgold. So all of these slave trading houses were doing well. that a modern kind of consumer item became ubiquitous, industrially produced, gaily painted, lead glazed beer vessels from the child labor pottery workshop of Staffordshire, shaped in the form of a comically figured man who was sometimes styled as a king. They were called Philpots, but more commonly referred to as Toby jugs. Their popularization of household objects was preceded by several decades of what J. A. Leo LeMay characterizes as a minor subgene of poetry concerning drunks who were transformed into liquor containers, as per, dear sir, this brown jug that now foams with the lid with a railed ale was once Toby Philpot and thirsty old soul. Such works as the witty Boston clergyman Mather Byles, the transformation of Bug Barrett into a brandy bottle inspired the full 27-year-old Pennsylvania Gazette printer Benjamin Franklin to publish his mock meditation on a quart jug, in which he compared to the soul in the jug to an abused slave. So he compared his soul to the soul in the jug to an abused slave, saying, alas, what power or place is provided? Where is this poor mug, this unpitied slave, can have redress of his wrongs and sufferings? Or where shall he have a word of praise bestowed upon him for his well doings and faithful services? Poor mug, unfortunate is thy condition. Of thyself thou wouldst not do harm, but much harm is done with thee. Thou art accused of many mischiefs throughout, though art said to administer drunkenness, poison, and broken hearts, but none praise thee for the good things thou yieldest. In the Catholic territories, iconic statues of saints abounded and were syncretized by Africans for their own religious purposes. So, what does that mean? The Africans looked at the pictures of these saints and they made up a parallel story that would go along with the picture of their, that would go along with the picture of the saints that they had. The Santo was that priest called Santa Barbara, for example, who holds a hatchet in her hand, became for the enslaved the image of Shango, the womanizing axe wielding warrior Apophis of machinery, the greatest dancer, the owner of thunder and drums, whose colors are red and white, and who is called by specific rhythms that are known to millions of Cubans. This kind of syncretization is often said not to have existed in the Protestant Anglo-Saxon territories, where saints did not exist, to say nothing of sacred statues. But the figurative power of the Toby jug seems to have been spoken to the African born to the not yet born Christianized African Americans who carried bound up spirits with them. The Toby jug, it would appear, lent its name to a syncretized African practice in the 18th century. Chesapeake was what Chesapeake that was unseen and uncomprehended by the merchants who sold both the jugs and the people, a container that holds a soul that needs no explanation to Africans, to fit right into the needs of the enslaved, to fit right into the needs, it fit right into the needs of the enslaved, the old hoodoo religion. In their captivity, the enslaved could bring nothing more with them than their souls, their minds, and the bodies that contained them. While the slave owners repurposed the ballast stones from England for wharfing, the enslaved repurposed what they found in their hostile new world, trying to protect themselves however they could with nails, spirit bundles, cowries, coins, resistance, and readiness to fight and rebellion. And that is the end of chapter 18. We made it to the end, guys. We'll be moving on to chapter 19, which starts on page 225. Did you guys have anything you wanted to say? Because as you can see, these people did a lot in an attempt to quelch and squash our spirit, but never, never, never do they squash our spirit. We make up religions in the attempt to reinforce and highlight the connection that we have to God. We will put together spirit bags and mojo bags, as some people call them, and Tobies, as some people call them, in an attempt to pull together and thread together some semblance of what our relationship with God is all about. All right, guys, I'm going to end it right there for tonight. Hopefully, you enjoyed this reading. Maybe it gave you some peace. Maybe it frustrated you because to know that these people are hypocrites, that Ben Franklin is, oh, he's a good guy, oh, he's an abolitionist, but he's making friends with slavers, is an interesting point to take on. All of these people that we are told are our heroes are really people that were on the side of our enslavement. Sister Ross says it's called spirituality. Exactly. We have a spirituality about ourselves that other people don't, that not even our enslavement could break. We have a connection to God, a connection to our Creator that is greater than any book, that is greater than any organized set of principles. We have a connection, and we will find a way to express that connection to our Creator in any way, shape, form, or fashion possible because it's important to us. Because remember, they didn't want us Christianized initially. It wasn't until they learned how to colonize the information that was being conveyed in Christendom that they wanted us to then become Christianized. I want to thank Sister Raw, The Forecast, and Zachary Holmes for being here. I know that Manning for Mayor is here. I know that Brother Bakari is here. Bawana Haguziki is listening. I know that Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is listening. I know that MG2 is listening. I know that so many others are listening. I appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you for your gifts and for sowing into my life. You're important to me. That's why we have this special presentation late at night because I was getting too far away from delivering this content twice a week like I had vowed to do. And I wanted to make sure that I got back on target. So thank you for listening. I will be back Thursday with Brainwashed, which is another good book by Tom Burrell. We are talking about how these different stereotypes that Black people play into are cultivated and crafted through the propaganda of the machine, and we are deconstructing them. I'll be back here reading this particular book next Tuesday, hopefully at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But if not, then you will definitely get an update if you are subscribed to my channel. Thank you all so much for listening. I value each and every one of you. And peace, guys.